On February 19, 1942, thousands of Japanese American citizens had awoken to find themselves facing Executive Order 9066, an eviction notice demanding that everyone born of Japanese descent was to leave their homes immediately or face compulsory imprisonment. The Japanese Navy's recent attacks on Hawaii's Pearl Harbor both angered the public and gave the American government what they deemed as justification for this arrogant order. With no regard for their loyalty or status, Japanese Americans were labeled as traitors to the nation. Distraught, these men, women, and children only had 48 hours to gather the vestige of their entire lives before submitting to the foreboding misery of war.
Japanese American citizens in the western United States faced alienation and bicultural struggle during the Great Depression, which followed the marginalized community as they were urged to participate in the all-American efforts of World War II. In exacerbating the weak social, economic, and political standing of Japanese Americans, these obstacles of discrimination, mass hysteria, and internment prevented not only the recognition of their vital role in the framework of American society, but also the achievement of their civil rights and aspirations to embrace Japanese American culture.
The Great Depression was a dark economic recession characterized by high unemployment rates, serious deflation, and a meager quality of life. Americans across the country struggled to obtain necessities to live. Businesses targeted people of color on a last hired, first fired basis, plummeting Black, Asian, and other racial groups into low social and economic standing. Issei, first generation, and Nisei, second generation, Japanese Americans used these bleak times as an excellent opportunity to establish a Japanese cultural identity within their new country.
With the bridge metaphor, the Nisei were able to adjust America's perspective of them as foreign invaders. This metaphor emphasized the idea that all individuals were not tied down to one culture, but instead they were people of a collective with the ability to move across cultural boundaries. Unfortunately, the efforts to integrate Japanese and American culture had failed, as it could not withstand the mass hysteria from the bombing of Pearl Harbor. The catastrophic war that ensued erased any of the progress the Japanese Americans had made in building social standing within the country.
During the war, many more jobs became available to support the efforts of the war. Prior policies, such as the Chinese Exclusion Act, crafted a narrative of racial inferiority and hostility that extended to those with Japanese heritage. Despite this, Japanese Americans worked hard to establish respectable reputations within different sectors of the community, becoming civic officials, nurses, farmers, and other vital professionals. They strove to prove their purpose and value in American society. However, the cultural foundation they had built was completely disregarded after the attacks of Pearl Harbor in 1941.
Although these citizens were encouraged to contribute to the war effort, they were not recognized as true Americans in the eyes of white supremacist ideologies. America's fear and distrust of Japanese Americans culminated in the case of Korematsu versus the United States. The verdict upheld the constitutionality of Japanese internment camps despite their inhumane conditions. White Americans, from high-ranked state officials and businessmen to low-class clerks and farmers, took advantage of the incarceration, confiscating Japanese American citizens' properties and livelihoods.
Economic competition served as the main justification behind their motivation to let white men take over and produce everything the Japanese grows. Internment bulldozed any markers of success Japanese Americans had painstakingly achieved. With their economic foundations overthrown, the community's understanding of success regarding the American dream was reduced to mere survival, rebuilding, and seeking justice for their unsung efforts through the war. No financial reparations were enough to compensate for the sundering of their cultural pride.
The events of war provided a prime opportunity for America to employ animosity and hatred towards its Japanese squatters. This hostility was implemented through measures like the Loyalty Questionnaire, a legal document that targeted all Japanese Americans regardless of their social standing or contributions to American society. The Loyalty Questionnaire posed a series of extremely invasive questions designed to assess loyalty to the United States. It aimed to aid the War Department in recruiting an all-Nisei combat unit and act as a bulwark against the fears of espionage.
Stirring distress among internment camps, questions 27 and 28 demanded that by responding yes, yes, respondents destroyed their cultural identity through 3 life-changing statements. They renounced their allegiance to the Japanese emperor, swore their loyalty to the United States, and swore they would serve in war combat wherever they were ordered. The 1924 Alien Land Law declared Issei were ineligible for citizenship, and their affirmative response to the questionnaire rendered many as people without a country. Japanese Americans had been completely disregarded without backing from a nation they believed would grant them a greater social mobility and free opportunity.
Moreover, the assumed racial allegiance to Japan was offensive to Japanese Americans who had spent their lives in America trying to prove their rights to live there. Forced to navigate between a foreign culture to which many had no real ties and an American society that rejected their assimilation, Japanese Americans walked on a faulty tightrope. The loyalty questionnaire was unsuccessful in its aim to recruit military personnel, yet was able to highlight the manipulation and systemic discrimination Japanese Americans endured. The people faced psychological and cultural wounds within their community that reverberated long after the war.
The wound that formed during the wrongful incarceration of these thousands of Japanese Americans was slow to heal. Enduring stigmatization and trauma in the aftershocks of the war, internment left many families unable to financially reestablish themselves in society. Leaving the internment camps with only what could be carried mirrors Issei's journeys to America, both driven by forces out of their control. A lack of job opportunities limited them to only finding positions within domestic service, gardening, and the clothing industry. Several of these incarcerated citizens became inspired to work toward change. Imprisoned in a camp with her family during World War II, Amy Iwasaki-Masa's experiences later led to her participation in the redress movement, which was the prerequisite for the Civil Liberties Act of 1988, giving surviving Japanese Americans $20,000 in reparations and a formal apology by President Reagan for their incarceration during World War II.
The legislation was not passed until years following the initial incarceration, long past the psychological setback that culminated. What happened to these men, women, and children was cruel and unjust. Forcing these human beings to be prisoners in their homeland was not something that could heal with an apology and green paper. The community faced damage, both material and impalpable, that bleeds through families for generations. Even after the closing of the internment camps, the distance between Alice and her parents never disappeared. Though they were free, the silence of their shared trauma lingered in the air, as any loneliness or problems she did not share with anyone, particularly her parents, since she felt they had many more problems.
The emotional scars of internment created a rift between Issei, who tried to maintain cultural values and tradition, and Nisei, who felt conflicted between honoring their heritage and embracing the very society that wronged them. The harsh realities of post-war prevented Japanese Americans from grasping the opportunities the American dream promised. To remember and acknowledge their suffering gives some semblance of justice. Their path to healing continues, with several descendants successfully keeping the memory of their ancestors alive and advocating for their rights as Americans.
While the legislation was not passed until many years after the initial incarceration, it begins to show the slow improvement and healing for the victims. What happened to these men, women, and children was cruel and unjust. Forcing these human beings to be prisoners in their homeland was not something that could heal with an apology and green paper. To remember is the only way that these fellow human beings can receive some semblance of justice. Their path to healing continues, with several descendants successfully keeping the memory of their ancestors alive and advocating for their rights as Americans.
The process of Japanese Americans and their pursuit to build lives, families, and businesses despite the harsh social and economic obstacles was fragile. Systemic discrimination and mass hysteria severely disrupted upward mobility in society. Ranging from unjust accusations of espionage to the outright violation of civil rights, America failed to acknowledge the humanity of Japanese Americans. The same nation that demanded their allegiance in military service simultaneously rejected them as citizens.
They never truly considered them its people. The hurtful stigma American society has forced upon Japanese Americans continues past Nisei and Issei generations in our modern day, and is, unfortunately, the result of prejudice and fear. What should have been moments of American courage and unity in the face of adversity instead deepened the wounds of Japanese Americans in a poor solution to save the country.